Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Public History with Jake and Justin. I'm Jake Wynn. Justin is out this week. In this episode of the podcast, we are doing something a little different. This month marks the 160th anniversary of the Overland Campaign in the Civil War. This campaign, lasting for 6 weeks from May to June 1864, marked a major milestone in America's bloodiest conflict. It's an era in history that's part of my public history journey as well. I spent a summer at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park interpreting these battlefields as a summer intern. It changed my career path and shaped me as a public historian. This is the story of one family's loss during that campaign that I researched during my time on the battlefields that summer. The Workman family and their small community of Wiconisco Township, Pennsylvania, was forever altered by the events of May 1864. This story is adapted from a 2017 story from my blog. It's May 13th, 1864. Smoke and fog hangs low over a battlefield strewn with lifeless men, dead horses, churned earth, and the scattered debris left behind by a fierce Civil War battle. Emerging from hastily dug trenches, the veterans of the 96th Pennsylvania trudged forward over a muddy, shell-pocked landscape. They were soaked to the skin, a long night of heavy rain drenching them and all of their equipment. Exhaustion from more than a week of nearly constant contact with the enemy had left the remaining men of the regiment in less than pristine condition. Occupying the front line 3 miles north of the Virginia hamlet of Spotsylvania Courthouse, this landscape was the site of a multi-day battle of hellish proportions. As the tired men of the 96th PA moved forward, they were crossing a stretch of battlefield where they had fought 3 days earlier, on May 10th, 1864. Corporal Henry Kaiser of the 96th wrote in his diary that day, quote, May 13th, 1864. At 1 o'clock today, we left the woods and halted where we had made the charge and gathered some of our dead, who were swollen and bloated so that they could scarcely be recognized, unquote. Among the dead Kaiser and his surviving comrades found were 2 young brothers from Kaiser's hometown of Wiconisco, Pennsylvania, Josiah and Frank Workman. Their journey to a shallow grave near the Confederate earthworks at Spotsylvania Courthouse is remarkable, and yet also representative of the lives cut short by the horrific fighting in Virginia in May 1864. Let's go back and learn their story. In the growing village of Wiconisco, Pennsylvania, Jacob and Mary Workman were not alone in their poverty. Jacob was employed in the coal mines that skirted the northern edge of town, while his wife kept house and gave birth to a string of children. Josiah was the couple's 3rd child and was likely born in 1844 or 1845. 3 years later, Franklin Workman arrived. The family lived with very little, and the children were expected to go to work in the mines at a young age. Wiconisco Township could be found about an afternoon's train ride north of Pennsylvania's state capital at Harrisburg, a small industrial village where anthracite coal mining was the chief occupation and employer. Tragedy struck the family in 1857. After a week of illness, Jacob Workman died on August 11, 1857. Mary was left to raise 9 children on her own. Around this time, at age 11 or 12, Josiah began work in the coal mines just north of town. According to family friends, Josiah brought in about $4 per week in wages home to his mother. Along with the meager wages of an older brother, David, this was the money expected to support a family of 10. These wages were often subject to highly dubious cuts and subtractions at the order of the mining company management ruling the region's mines. Likely employed either as a breaker boy, sorting coal from slate, or as a mule driver in the mines, Josiah would have been expected to work long hours in highly dangerous working conditions. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, military service presented the now 16-year-old Josiah with an opportunity to get out of Wiconisco, both to serve his country and to gain a steady paycheck. His older brother David enlisted first. He joined the town's militia company when it marched off to war in April 1861 as Company F, 10th Pennsylvania Infantry. Josiah got his chance to serve when his brother returned from the front in August of that year. Volunteers from the militia unit formed a new company on September 24, 1861, under the command of Captain James N. Dowden. To get into the service, Josiah lied about his age. He told Captain Dowden that he was 18 and eligible to serve. On September 26th, Josiah marched off to Pottsville with about 20 other volunteers to join the 96th Pennsylvania. While training for war in the fall and winter of 1861, Private Josiah Workman designated $10 a month of his pay to his mother. Privates in the United States Army received $13 per month in pay, which in the early years of the war often came late. Very little is known of Workman's service in the 96th, other than the occasional mention in the diary of fellow Civil War soldiers Henry Kaiser. Workman and Kaiser were in the same company but came from entirely different social stratas within the Wiconisco community. The diarist's father, Daniel Kaiser, operated Wiconisco's powder factory, where the explosives needed for the town's mines were manufactured, and served a term in the Pennsylvania legislature during the Civil War. Workman came from a laboring class squeaking by on minuscule wages. While fighting on the Virginia Peninsula in June 1862, Kaiser noted that Josiah Workman had fallen ill, but it seems his recovery occurred within the camp of the regiment. It was likely on the peninsula near the Confederate capital at Richmond that Workman saw combat for the first time. Yet it was in Maryland in September 1862 where he came face to face with the dangers of a Civil War battlefield. On September 14, 1862, the 96th Pennsylvania were tasked with leading the advance toward a Confederate position on the side of a mountain near the town of Burkittsville, Maryland. In a bloody but ultimately successful advance, the regiment forced the Confederates to retreat from a strategically important ridgeline known as Crampton's Gap. In doing so, the regiment lost 20 men killed and another 71 wounded, which included the young Private Josiah Workman. During the assault, a Confederate bullet struck Workman across his arm and chest. The wound, Henry Kaiser called it slight, put him in a field hospital in Frederick, Maryland for 3 months. On his return to the regiment, he had the duty of informing the regiment that another soldier, W. Thompson, had passed away in Frederick's hospitals from complications related to typhoid fever. The year 1863 brought more action for the 96th Pennsylvania. Private Workman saw service at the Battle of Salem Church in May, the Battle of Gettysburg in July, and at the Battle of Rappahannock Station in November. All the while, Josiah continued to send most of his private's wages home to his mother and family in Pennsylvania. For the Workman family, everything changed in February 1864. The Army of the Potomac, the U.S. Army to which the 96th Pennsylvania was attached, began to fear that many of its veteran units were going to refuse to re-enlist in the Army if some inducement were not put in place to keep them. The 96th Pennsylvania had signed enlistment papers for 3 years back in September 1861, and their enlistments would end in September 1864 if the regiment did not re-enlist. Back in Wiconisco, Pennsylvania, young Franklin Workman enlisted in Company G, claiming to be age 17. He was likely only 15 at the time of his enlistment. Numerous men from the company returned to Wiconisco Township on a furlough in March 1864, including Josiah Workman. He spent 30 days with his family, and when returning to the regiment, brought his younger brother Frank back with him to the regiment's encampment near Brandy Station, Virginia. Both brothers sent home sizable bounties, essentially enlistment bonuses, to their mother in Wiconisco Township. The large amount of money, likely in excess of $600, bought their mother her first home. Private Frank Workman saw his first combat alongside his brother when the 96th Pennsylvania went into Virginia's infamous Wilderness with the rest of the Army of the Potomac on May 5, 1864. Following 2 heavy days of fighting in thick forests, the Union Army moved southeast toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. Days later, the 6th Corps, to which the 96th Pennsylvania was attached, became responsible for holding the center of the U.S. Army line at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Fighting in this new campaign featured both sides utilizing field works and entrenchments, and the Confederates at Spotsylvania were behind strong earthen defenses known as the Mule Shoe for its shape. The Pennsylvanians' brigade commander, Colonel Emory Upton, took the initiative on May 10, 1864, and planned an assault on the Confederate works that would use the 96th Pennsylvania as one of its frontline units. At 5 o'clock in the evening, the regiment and 11 other units jumped into action and ran across 250 yards of open ground to attack the Confederate Mule Shoe. Henry Kaiser recorded the attack in his diary. Quote, "We were marched a short distance from camp in light marching orders to form a charging line, and were also one of the first regiments to get into line. We then had orders to lie down, the rebels peppering away at us while the balance of the troops were getting into line. The Rebs were about 200 yards away with strong rifle pits with head bags for protection. At 6 o'clock p.m., all being in readiness, the command to charge was given with instructions to reserve our fire until we jumped the rifle pits, which proved lucky for us as most of the rebels' guns weren't loaded and they were at our mercy. Although nearly half of our line was shot down before we reached the pit. We started on the full run with cheers. Many a poor fellow fell pierced with rebel bullets before we reached the rifle pits." Unquote. Among those struck down before the regiment reached the Confederate trenches were Josiah and Frank Workman. Their remains were left between the lines when their unit and all of the other U.S. Army attackers were forced to retreat. The attack had failed. 3 days later, after even more brutal fighting at the Mule Shoe on May 12, 1864, the U.S. Army finally captured the Confederate earthworks they had attempted to take on May 10th. Henry Kaiser found the bodies of his comrades, Frank and Josiah Workman, lying just feet apart. Kaiser recorded how he found them in his diary. Quote, "Frank Workman was shot through the breast with grape shot. Josiah Workman was shot through the side. We buried them in one trench, first placing a blanket underneath and one on top, placing a board of a cracker box at the head of each, with name, company, and regiment." Unquote. And then the regiment moved on with the rest of the United States Army toward new battlefields, leaving the Workman brothers and 30 other members of the 96th Pennsylvania behind as killed in action, while a further 39 were listed on the rolls as missing. Back in Wiconisco Township, the news from Spotsylvania landed like a thunderbolt. 6 soldiers from the communities of Wiconisco and Likens were killed in the charge at Spotsylvania Courthouse on May 10, 1864. Numerous others were severely wounded or captured by Confederates. The reaction to this news in the Workman home isn't known, but it must have been a devastating blow. Using the bounty money the brothers had received from the government upon their enlistments in February 1864, Mary Workman had purchased a home in the neighboring town of Likens. She was relying upon their monthly wages from the Army to maintain herself and her family. The death of Josiah and Frank must have sent the family into a tailspin. Pooling their resources and legal know-how, local businessmen banded together to assist Mary in applying for a dependent's pension from the United States government in the summer of 1864. Among these dignitaries providing legal aid to Mrs. Workman was Henry Kaiser's father, Daniel. For the deaths of her 2 sons in the service of the United States Army, Mary Workman received a meager pension of $8 per month. She didn't begin receiving the money until May 1868. The pension continued until her death in Wiconisco Township on September 25, 1880. The mother of 2 fallen Union soldiers was 55. Following the Civil War, the remains of Josiah and Frank Workman were removed from their shallow battlefield graves and moved to a permanent home in Fredericksburg National Cemetery. We remember their service and sacrifice in the fight to save the Union. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Public History with Jake and Justin. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to rate this podcast and submit a review. This has been Jake Wynn. We'll talk to you again soon.